Okay, we're a few minutes past 11, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with our existing attendees. And as you trickle in, we're going through some introductory stuff, so you won't be missing any major information. Well, I mean, some major information. Anyway, welcome to today's event. I'm Teresa Schmidt. I work for the University of Michigan Press. And so first we'll go over just some features of the Zoom webinar. So all of your audio and video are muted. If you're an attendee, you should be able to see us on the screen. Q&A and chat are both enabled. For this presentation, feel free to let us know in the chat if you're having any technical issues, or you can also email the email addresses that have been sending you the information for today's Zoom meeting. The chat, you can select who you want it to go to. If you do all panelists, that'll directly let us know as your hosts about issues. If you have just general conversation you want to share, you can do all panelists and attendees. And then for Q&A, you can choose whether or not to send an anonymous question. And we really encourage you to utilize this feature for any questions you have for our presenter today, Melissa, Mary, and we'll make sure that these get addressed throughout the talk today. Some quick notes on just any needs that may come up throughout the course of this presentation. So we will work to moderate the Q&A today and the chat. If any of the topics, upset you, we encourage you to listen actively and use empathy, treat everyone as individuals, and try not to make assumptions based on, stereotypes or groups that people identify themselves as part of. If you do feel uncomfortable, please take care of yourself. We understand if you have to leave the talk or, for a little while, we won't be bothered. And just to be respectful of others and accept that, we are having a conversation today that's open to everyone and trying to just share the wonderful scholarship that's within the book that we're discussing today. So a little bit about our talk series. So we've run these events Thursdays from June throughout August. It's an opportunity for you to interact with our University of Michigan Press authors and learn about their latest work directly from them. And we really we want you to think of this as, obviously we have to be virtual right now due to greater circumstances, but that's honestly allowed us to get all of these authors that hail from all over the country and even the world to participate, which we're really grateful for. So please feel free to engage in this experience. We really want you to participate in the chat, in the Q&A. There'll be polls and reflection questions throughout the presentation as well that we encourage you to be a part of. And to start with that, we're going to go ahead and start a poll, just trying to get a sense of who's in our audience today. So if you can answer what is your primary role, and that's going to launch now. Just again, because we'll tailor the conversation if we know that you're instructors, librarians, particularly for Melissa, she can share more information about her book with that in mind. Seen couple librarians, interested reader, other researcher. I'll let that go for just a little bit longer. All right. And then I'll go ahead and move along as we wait to conclude that poll. So the University of Michigan Press. So we've been around for 90 years. There we go quickly, just showing an overview of our audience right now. So fairly mixed overall. Some librarians, always nice to see you guys in our talks. Anyway, so yes, we've been around for 90 years. We publish 100 books, give or take a year. We have a lot of strong titles in political science, performing arts, classics, really a diverse lineup. We also have a specialized wing for English language teaching and also covering the great trade titles covering the Great Lakes. And we have a huge commitment to digital scholarship. We promote open access pretty regularly among our titles. And one way that we do that is with our ebook collection. Actually, all of the books covered in our Author Live Talk series this summer have been made available free to read on our Fulcrum platform through the end of August, which is pretty cool. Fulcrum is our open source platform that we've developed here at the University of Michigan. And it really is a new way of reading books digitally, enabling things like 3D models, embedded audio and video, and some really cool features that allow us to bring not just traditional ebooks to the world, but also works that really could not exist outside of this platform that are really unique in scholarship. And this is a service that's available to libraries through Lyrasis. And with that, I'm going to pass on to our featured author today, Melissa Mary, and so that we can hear about her book, Warped Narratives. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks to the University of Michigan Press for this opportunity to talk about my book. I'm very excited to share my research. So to go ahead and dive right in, let's go to the next slide. And talk about what this book is about. So I study the communications of gun control and gun rights organizations to identify how they frame the issue, to examine why they frame the issue in particular ways, and to explore the consequences of their framing of the gun policy issue for both politics and public policy. And the title, Warped Narratives, hints at this argument. A warped policy debate is one in which there's a distortion of the issue. In other words, the way that political actors talk about gun policy does not accurately reflect the nature of the problem. And warping, or this distortion, is a process that happens over time, and it's through the accumulated framing choices of many different political actors. So this includes elected officials, it includes the media, and it includes interest groups. My focus is on gun policy groups, so both gun control organizations and gun rights organizations. And both types of groups construct policy narratives when they're talking about the issue. And in these narratives, I argue they emphasize atypical characters and settings. And it's not just one side of the issue that is to blame. This is more of a general dysfunction of the policymaking process that likely contributes to the policy stalemate at the federal level and the failure of government to make a more significant dent in the problem of gun violence. So to demonstrate this warping of the issue, I conducted a large-scale content analysis looking at nearly 67,000 communications of both gun control and gun rights organizations, 15 groups in total, from the year 2000 to 2017. And I look at 4 different media. I look at blog posts, emails, press releases, and Facebook posts. And this covers sort of a range of communications, some in which groups are mainly communicating to their core constituencies, and other forums in which groups are reaching out to the broader public. And in terms of the methodology that I use, I use automated content analysis, so a computer program that identifies keywords and topics, and that is in combination with sort of in-depth examination of selected communications. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so to get back to this idea, this concept of warping and how both sides are doing this. So gun control groups highlight white victims and child victims and mass shootings in suburban locations. Gun rights organizations emphasize self-defense situations such as home invasions and robberies. Why are groups doing this? I sort of start by assuming that groups are not intentionally misleading. And they're not technically lying. They're sort of just telling one version of the truth. And given that gun violence is a complex problem with multiple causes and consequences, there are many different plausible versions. So just to give an example of this, let's say there's a mass shooting that happens in a school. There can be different interpretations of what happened. One interpretation is that this is the result of lax gun regulations. Another interpretation is that the school had inadequate security. So there are competing plausible interpretations. And what interest groups do is they focus on the version that they view as the most effective way to shape public opinion and to mobilize their supporters. So thinking about this from the perspective of gun control organizations, their core constituency is disproportionately white and middle and upper middle class. And to appeal to this constituency, it makes sense for gun control groups to highlight characters and settings that sort of hit close to home, that seem familiar and proximate, and to highlight victims that are positively socially constructed, hence the emphasis on children. From the gun rights perspective, focusing on home invasions and robberies does something similar. It makes the issue hit close to home to gun owners and gun rights supporters, and also focuses on a positively constructed character, i.e. law-abiding citizens. How does this then contribute to the distortion of the policy debate? So two things that I'll highlight there. One is that both types of organizations rarely mention the role of race in gun violence, despite the fact that gun violence disproportionately affects racial minorities. Second, both types of organizations rarely mention the leading cause of gun fatalities, which is suicide. So suicide accounts for approximately 60% of annual gun fatalities. And that's not something that you would know by reading the communications of gun policy organizations. And this, I argue, is problematic for both politics and policy making. So in terms of policy making, the way we talk about and understand a problem has consequences for the kinds of solutions that are considered and ultimately adopted. And let's say the focus is on mass shootings and gun crime generally. So if politicians are focusing on reducing gun crime, they're likely to focus on things like expanding background checks, licensing and registration requirements, and perhaps banning certain types of weapons. And these might be effective with respect to certain types of gun crime. However, they are unlikely to make a dent in other types of gun violence, such as accidental shootings in the home or the problem of suicide. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, so why is this book important now? Every year, 35,000 people are killed with guns, and at least twice that number of people are injured with guns. And that doesn't even really capture the full scope of the problem. So you have to also account for the witnesses to gun violence, the family members and friends of gun violence victims. So there's a great deal of trauma. And this is a very persistent policy problem that's been going on for decades with really no major dent in the problem. Additionally, there has been no major federal legislation to deal with the problem since the mid-1990s. So in the mid-1990s, the Brady Bill passed, and that led to the implementation of the background check system. There was also a ban in place on assault weapons, but that has since expired. And this isn't to say that there has been no action on the issue in terms of policy making, but most of it has been at the state level, and it's been sort of a mixture of laws making, liberalizing gun regulations, sort of loosening regulations, and others tightening regulations. So I argue if we hope to find a way to substantially reduce gun injuries and deaths, we really need to better understand the political obstacles. And I argue that one of those obstacles is this distortion of the policy debate. And this is something that actually I think gun policy groups should be interested in. They should be concerned about it. And not only because when the debate is warped, that really hinders the search for effective solutions, but also because when groups engage in this process, it sort of makes sense in the short term to energize their constituencies and to mobilize their supporters. But I argue that long term, this is going to limit their political power. And how is that? It's going to make it difficult to build diverse and broad-based coalitions. So when gun control groups focus on mass shootings with predominantly white victims, this is going to potentially alienate African Americans who feel that their suffering is being ignored. And when groups like the National Rifle Association are silent on Black gun ownership, and some of the events in which Black gun owners have actually been shot and killed by police, and the example that comes to mind is Philando Castile. When groups like the NRA don't sort of, take a stand in support of individuals like Philando Castile, then that potentially alienates African Americans as well. So that is potentially problematic for both sides of the issue when they're sort of limiting their constituency. And then in addition, when groups are engaging in this process and they're talking about the issue in such vastly different ways, it's like they're speaking two different languages, and the prospects of any kind of political compromise it just diminishes that possibility of compromise. And then another way in which I think my book offers a contribution today is in looking at the role of race in gun violence. So there's been a lot of scholarship on race in sort of the history of gun policy, but there is very little work looking at how interest groups talk about race. And this is really, I think, especially important in this political moment. So race issues have become very salient, and we're seeing how systematic discrimination against minorities influences healthcare, creates biases in the criminal justice system. So it's really just incredibly important to look at the intersection of race and a variety of public policy issues, including gun politics. So I think my book is really the first to systematically examine the role of race in the framing of gun policy organizations. Okay, so what is sort of the motivation for this research? So as a political scientist, my work fits largely into policy studies. So I'm very interested in generally in why some issues grab our attention at certain moments and other issues get neglected, why certain policy solutions are chosen over others. And my interests are, span multiple policy areas. So in previous research, I looked at environmental policy. And I've been very fascinated with what are called focusing events. So a focusing event is a sudden dramatic event that draws attention to the failures of government policy. And it represents an opportunity for agenda setting, so the issue can rise up on the government's agenda, and it's also an opportunity for policy change. Now, a lot of times no change happens. So in previous research, I looked at the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And that was a really interesting and long drawn out focusing event that led to limited policy change. And mass shootings represent a different type of focusing event. And there's this interesting cycle that happens whereby a mass shooting happens and the public is rightly horrified by the event and outraged, and there are calls for policy change for a period of time, and then nothing happens, and attention recedes and moves on to the next topic, and then the cycle repeats as when the next mass shooting happens. So I was interested in exploring this dynamic, this cyclical process. And that led me to thinking about just sort of the broader contours of how gun policy groups frame the issue, not just during mass shootings, but during sort of ordinary routine politics, which led me to this identification of a warped policy debate. So you can see in the figure there on the slide that attention to mass shootings, goes sort of up and down, increased pretty dramatically after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut in 2012. So that's an illustration here. And it shows you that in some, at some points, mass shootings are mentioned in, say, roughly 40% of gun control groups' communications. So they're talking about mass shootings a great deal of the time. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so here's our poll question, just to kind of get a sense of your perceptions of how much mass shootings account for the problem of gun violence. So what percentage of gun fatalities do you think are attributable to mass shootings? And I can't see if people have voted yet, so I'll let Teresa.
Good. Got most of them so far. I'll give a couple more seconds. So far, the most popular answer is less than 1%, with a couple votes for 8%. Anybody else want to vote? If not, I will go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, so this is a smart audience today. This is actually really encouraging to me, because when this type of question is asked in public opinion surveys, people get it wrong. They usually estimate that mass shootings account for a much larger share of annual gun fatalities. And that's because there's so much emphasis on mass shootings in the media and from gun policy organizations. And that is the illustration of this warping process. But I'm encouraged to know that that this audience at least has a much more accurate perception of the nature of the policy problem itself. Okay, so given the salience of the issue of race right now in American politics, I thought it would be interesting to sort of highlight some of my findings around how race figured into gun policy groups' framing. In my book, I have chapters on different narrative elements. So there's different characters that are part of a narrative. There's the victim, villain, which is usually a perpetrator of gun violence, and then there's a setting in which gun violence occurs. So it can be a mass shooting, it can be an accidental shooting, it can be a domestic violence incident, it can be sort of a self-defense situation. And the issue of race sort of permeates the chapters on characters, on victims and perpetrators. So as I previously mentioned, these groups hardly ever talk about race explicitly. So starting with gun control groups, they rarely mention the issue a little bit more in blog posts, emails, and press releases. So 6% of those communications had some reference to race. 1.5% of their Facebook posts mentioned race. Notably, it's not the mainstream organizations, so groups like the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence and Everytown for Gun Safety. They're not the main organizations bringing this up. It is the smaller and more peripheral groups. So groups like Cure Violence, which is an organization that focuses on the spread of gun violence in communities. And the Violence Policy Center, and a newer group called Gays Against Guns that formed after the Pulse nightclub shooting. And because these groups are small, they just don't have as wide of a reach. So the fact that they are talking about race is encouraging, but it doesn't really suggest that this is influencing public opinion to a large extent. Moving to the gun rights organizations, they talk about race even less. So they're talking about it in 3.9% of blog posts and emails and press releases, and just 0.4% of their Facebook posts. And they're not really talking about how racial minorities are disproportionately likely to be the victims of gun violence. Rather, race comes up as a way for the gun rights groups to claim that they are the victims of social bigotry and that they deserve to have their rights respected. So this is an excerpt from a press release by the Second Amendment Foundation that is very typical of how race comes up in gun right groups' communications. So referencing Martin Luther King Jr., and it is an outrage that California law now treats gun buyers in much the same way that African Americans were treated in the South to prevent them from voting. So it's really not about African Americans, but rather it's about gun owners and gun rights supporters and how they feel that they have been discriminated against. So I'll pause here and talk about why aren't they talking about race? So this is an important, thing to think about. So there can be a few things that are going on here. One is that even though overt racism is no longer socially acceptable, racism continues to be a persistent fact of American life. And so that is sort of the broader context in which these groups are operating. And in the case of gun rights organizations, there is some research suggesting that the membership actually harbors what's called racial resentment. So talking about racial injustice isn't going to resonate with that audience. And more generally, mentioning race could sort of offend groups, largely white constituencies. And they would probably simply prefer to avoid confronting their own biases. So it's an uncomfortable topic that perhaps these groups just decide is better to be avoided. And there's also a very interesting, complicated history in which racism served as the impetus for both gun rights and for gun control. So if we look at the Second Amendment and its history, why it was put in the Constitution, there's good scholarship suggesting that this was in part to protect slave militias against, or state militias against slave revolts. And then on the gun control side, one interesting example is the passage of the Mulford Act in California in 1967. And among other things, this law outlawed public carrying of firearms. And it's pretty widely understood that this was a backlash against the armed Black Panthers. In 1968, there was a federal gun control law passed. And this is also widely understood as a reaction to some of the urban violence that was taking place in America at the time. So talking about race explicitly sort of brings up, or could bring up, this history that groups probably want to avoid discussing. So they don't explicitly talk about race, but race becomes something that is more implicit, and that's where racial code comes in. So if we can move on to the next slide here. Racial code refers to words and phrases that don't explicitly talk about race, but it is evoked. So phrases like dangerous people, street criminal, gang, thug is another one that is very common. And even the word criminal itself has an implicit racial association. And that actually comes from research in psychology, which shows that people tend to have an association between African Americans and criminality. So if you mention that, if you use the phrase dangerous people, or you talk about criminals, whether intentional or not, you are invoking this sort of underlying racial association. And so in some cases, I argue it's probably unintentional. In other cases, it is intentional. And I've got an example of each of these for you. So the quotation from Americans for Responsible Solutions, that's a Facebook post where they talk about loopholes in the law make it easier for dangerous people to get their hands on guns. So not explicitly talking about race, but by using that phrase and dangerous people, and talking about crime control in this way. So this is a very common way that gun control groups talk about the issue, the need to keep dangerous guns out of dangerous hands. And this is very common in gun control groups communications. And that's how I think we get to this finding of 35% of groups, blogs, press releases, and emails using racial code. And then somewhere between 2.9 and 3.4% of their Facebook communications mentioning racial code. Now, turning to gun rights organizations, they are, it's more, I think it is more intentional. They're using more obvious racial code. So you can see this in the quotation from a press release by the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, talking about drug gangs in the Windy City, street criminals don't have any trouble arming themselves, and we need to stop these dangerous thugs. So it's pretty clear what the intention of that press release is, to sort of call to mind these racial biases and associations between criminality and racial minorities. And so if we can, I think, move ahead to the next slide. Okay, so obviously this is very problematic. So groups are not only failing to highlight a major aspect of the policy problem, this is the fact that African Americans are disproportionately likely to be the victims of gun violence, but by using racial code, by sort of that being pervasive part of the framing of the issue, that in a way is reinforcing this association between African Americans and crime, and whether that's intentional or not. So I do make the case that groups need to rethink how they are framing the issue, that they need to much more self-consciously, or much more consciously discuss this facet of the problem, and also to try to reduce or eliminate the racial code that is part of their framing of the issue. And that by doing so, by sort of reducing how this debate is warped, I argue that could be a pathway to making some change on this issue. Okay, I think that's, yes. Okay, so this is our next poll. I just would like to get a sense from you about whether you think there are prospects for gun policy reform in the near or long-term future, because this is sort of a topic I address in the
book. And the Q&A feature is still open. You're welcome to ask any questions, especially, and that was very illuminating, Melissa. Thank you. I'm watching the votes come in. Got some mix of opinions so far. I'll give a couple more minutes for a couple of people. One question that I know I was thinking of as you were wrapping up was, so obviously, you know, or we want to eliminate things like racial code and talk more frankly about the realities of the issues, which are about, you know, race is involved. So what do you think, like if you were speaking to like both gun control groups and gun rights groups, like what's the benefit for them? Like how should they see it as, like why should they feel motivated to be more conscious about the way that they communicate about race and use racial codes in their communications on both sides? How would you?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, how I would pitch it to them is probably in terms of the political calculus. If you want to build a large movement, and if you want to have political momentum on your side to achieve your policy goals, you're going to have to rethink this a little bit. And there are opportunities. So it's not only the right thing to do, right? Because we want to be undoing racism, but that there's also an opportunity to bring new people into the movement, to make it a more diverse movement and a stronger movement. And in the end, that may help you overcome some of the obstacles that you have faced in the past.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go ahead and end our poll and share the results. So, yes.
Okay, so there's no clear winner here. So 2 people were optimistic that there will be restrictions within the next 4 years. 1 person says reduce restrictions. 2 people said just no, and 1 person said yes, but not in the next 4 years. And so that's really interesting. So I talk about in the book, you know, what circumstances could lead to major gun reform at the federal level. There's a lot more action at the state level. So, you know, a lot of states are moving very quickly to pass things like red flag laws, where somebody is has had a sort of a mental crisis or some situation where they need to have their gun rights taken away temporarily. That is made possible through those laws. But at the federal level, there's just sort of this stalemate, and has been for such a long time. So what could lead to major change? And the debate really is so polarized, right? So, you know, pretty much people are set in their opinions on the issue. You're either in favor of gun control or you're pretty much against it. And so it's not going to be a matter of getting one side to shift its opinions or to pull people from the other side. That's just not happening. So I think what could lead to major change would have to be electoral change, so electoral turnover. And 2020 is very much in play. If Biden wins the presidency and Democrats gain a majority in the Senate, things could change very quickly. So 2020 could, the 2020 election could change the political landscape very quickly in favor of enacting some kind of gun reform. And we saw that, you know, there was an opportunity in 2013 after the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting, and then major legislation was proposed and would have done things like expand background checks on on gun sales. It came very, very close to passing in the Senate. It was just a matter of a few votes short. So that's what we're talking about, is a few votes is the difference between nothing happening for the foreseeable future and then something big happening very quickly. So electoral turnover could be key. And then I also argue that there are some encouraging signs with it, especially on the gun control side of the issue, of groups working to broaden their coalition and to build a more diverse movement. So one of the signs relates to the student movement for gun control that came about after the Parkland high school shooting. And those students were incredibly impressive. They were so poised, so articulate in advocating in the immediate aftermath of that event. And they were also very aware of the need to be inclusive and reflect diversity within their movement. We're also seeing some interesting developments lately with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I suggest in my book that there actually could be opportunities on both sides. You know, gun control organizations could, you know, there is some common ground with Black Lives Matter in terms of the goal of reducing violence. There's some obstacles to this association as well, because gun control groups have long been affiliated with law enforcement. Law enforcement has been a huge ally of the gun control movement and was instrumental in helping pass the Brady Bill in the mid-90s. So gun control groups would probably need to distance themselves from their coalition with law enforcement. But if they, you know, if they did that, then they could potentially really make bigger gains in another area by joining forces with Black Lives Matter. And I recently did check in with my organizations. I went to their websites to see if they have anything to say about Black Lives Matter. And I was actually very surprised and impressed with what I saw. So some of the mainstream groups like the Brady Campaign, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, and Everytown for Gun Safety, they actually had statements that were very prominent on their websites. The Brady Campaign declared that police violence is gun violence. And the Everytown for Gun Safety group came out in support of policies that would reduce the militarization of law enforcement. So we're seeing, this is an interesting new development where we're seeing gun control groups start to realize that actually it makes sense to join forces with Black Lives Matter to find common ground. On the other side, there's potential room for gun rights groups to join forces with Black gun owners, right, and advocate for gun rights. So there are some interesting opportunities. I think we're seeing the gun control groups take much more advantage of that, and that's where really the movement is coming in. But I see these as more of long-term factors that I think will lead to sort of long-term, will increase the prospects for policy change long-term. And it's more of a generational change that I think is going to fundamentally alter the politics. But it's going to take some work. So these organizations have to really examine how they frame the issue and make some conscious decisions to change how they've been talking about it and they've been talking about it this way for decades.
Mm-hmm. So as you were talking, a question from the chat. So the objection to red flag laws, do you feel that that debate is distorted as well? And before you answer, I'm just going to remind everyone that you can continue to submit questions through either the Q&A or the chat, however you feel more comfortable.
Right. I do talk about mental illness and how interest group or how gun policy groups talk about mental illness. And that is another source of distortion in the gun policy debate, because especially some of these mass shootings that we are so familiar with, the perpetrators were mentally ill. So Virginia Tech, Newtown, the 2011 shooting that involved Gabrielle Giffords in Arizona, these perpetrators had serious mental illness. And what happens is people tend to associate mental illness with the threat of gun violence. And the fact of the matter is that most people who are mentally ill are never going to commit an act of gun violence. And so by emphasizing that, that is itself a source of distortion of the policy debate.
Thank you for that, Melissa. We still have time for anybody in the audience who wants to submit questions for Melissa and do that out loud. I'm going over one like figure from earlier in the presentation that I thought was interesting was the discussion about communications about different types of gun violence between the groups. And if I go back to that, I'm wondering if you could maybe like talk a little bit about.
Sure.
Let me go back here. Yes, this
Yes.
one.
Okay. Yeah. So these, I use these different types of gun violence to examine the role of settings in policy narratives. So accidental shootings that oftentimes happen in the home. Domestic violence situations in which the victims are often women and children, and these things have also happen in private spaces like homes. And you can sort of see, and then mass shootings, you can see that gun control organizations really disproportionately talk about mass shootings, and they don't talk about some of these other things. Obviously, suicide is something that they don't emphasize much at all, nor do they talk a lot about accidental shootings. So I think that the key takeaways from this graphic are the fact that gun control groups are really disproportionately emphasizing mass shootings. Domestic violence gets as much attention as it does because it's actually, there's some overlap with mass shootings. So in a lot of mass shooting situations, and I know this is like incredibly depressing to talk about, but oftentimes the perpetrator will kill a family member first, or killing a member of the family is sort of part of the act of the mass shooting. So it's through the overlap between domestic violence and mass shootings that gun control groups emphasize it as much as they do. And the gun rights organizations rarely talk about the things that gun control groups talk about. They only really talk about mass shootings when they are sort of forced to make a statement in about after about a week after a mass shooting happens. They will mostly focus on self-defense shootings and situations in which somebody has to use a firearm for self-defense. And this, I haven't talked about it much in this talk, but arguably this is another distortion of the debate, because these types of situations are rare, and justifiable homicides are very, very rare. There's a lot of debate about how common self-defense shootings are, and the NRA will tell you that there are 2.5 million self-defense situations per year. There's estimates that this is actually more like 60,000 per year. So there's a sort of a wide range of estimates about how common this situation is, but it's pretty clear that gun rights organizations are talking about these situations much more sort of out of proportion to their sort of prevalence as a cause of gun violence.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from the audience. What do you think will happen with the New York Attorney General moving to dissolve the NRA? How might that play out?
Yes, that's a great question. So the NRA has been having trouble for a while. And just to backtrack a little bit, the 2018 midterm elections were really interesting because that was the first election where gun control groups outspent the NRA to influence the election. So the NRA has been having some woes for some time, and the Attorney General of New York seeking to dissolve the NRA because of the corruption and self-dealing within the organization is another huge, huge blow to the organization. Now, I was browsing Twitter after this news came out, and I follow a lot of people who also study gun policy, and they're sort of skeptical that this is going to lead to it's obviously not the end of gun rights and the gun rights movement, because the sort of the constituency will still be there. Something like 3 in 10 Americans own guns. A substantial proportion of the public supports gun rights, and there are plenty of other gun rights organizations that are willing to take up the slack left by the NRA. So there's the Gun Owners of America, there's the National Association of Gun Rights, just to name a couple of them. And so I would guess, if the NRA is dissolved, which might not happen, right? There might be a settlement whereby the NRA gets to stay as an organization with some modifications in place. But if the NRA were dissolved, I think a lot of the people who are members of the NRA would just move to different organizations. So I don't see it it's certainly a blow to the gun rights side, but I don't see it as the sort of the final blow that sort of takes down the gun rights movement. I think that movement is here to stay, and it's just going to transform.
Of course. And then one more question from the chat. Are there distortions on either side regarding recreational use of firearms, such as hunting and shooting ranges, to support their views?
That's interesting, and it's not something that I really looked at or examined. What I've found more is that the people who are interested in recreational shooting sports are sort of, it used to be the NRA was an organization that was really focused on recreational shooting sports and gun safety for recreational purposes. And since the 1970s, when the NRA became much more political, the recreational folks were sort of pushed to the side. So if anything, those folks aren't getting as much representation as they would probably like. And many of them are probably members of the NRA, but they are not necessarily in agreement with some of the organization's objectives, and wouldn't mind certain restrictions like having expanded background checks on gun sales. So if anything, I would say those folks would probably deserve to get better representation of their views within the NRA in particular.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, Melissa, thank you so much for the talk today. We're almost at the end of our time, so I'm going to pass off to my colleague, Sean Manny, to talk a little bit about where you can go and get this book if you've enjoyed our talk today, which I know I certainly have.
Thanks so much, Teresa, and thanks to Professor Melissa Mary and to all of you in attendance. I just wanted to let you know that you can order Warped Narratives from our website, press.umich.edu, for 30% off using the code UMWarpedVA. You can also support your local bookshops for our speaker, that is Carmichael's in Louisville, and for folks in Ann Arbor, we have Bookbound, we also have Literati and Nicola's. And I would also like to remind you that you can currently still read the book for free until the end of August at the link that I'm throwing in the chat right now, as well as all of the other titles in the University of Michigan Press ebook collection. If you would like access beyond August 31st, please do talk to your organization's librarians.
Great, and thank you so much for everyone who joined today. If you have any questions that you wanted to ask and didn't get a chance to, feel free to reach out to us, or any questions about buying the book or anything else, we're happy to help. A recording of this talk will be available shortly today, and we appreciate everyone who came here. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you had a great time listening to us. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.